song. I think all of you know that if you want to sing along. Working on the railroad. So before we get started, can I see a show of hands of anyone that had family members that worked on the railroad or for the railroad? Okay, so just a few. And then if we have time at the end, I do have a lot of slides again this time. Maybe if you want to share any stories about that. So working on the railroad. Many Jackson County residents found employment working for the railroad. There were many different positions available with the building of the tracks, and once completed, many more needed for the day-to-day operations. The pay must have been good, as I noticed in the censuses, a lot of the people had no mortgage on their homes that worked for the railroads. And then also many of them, just stuck with it, stayed there for decades, and had siblings working there too. So I think it was a good place to be employed for many years. So this photo depicts the Maquoketa Depot. And I don't know when this picture was taken, but any idea? Anybody?
So wouldn't that be the depot that's down by city limits now?
I'm not sure.
Well,
It was listed for sale on eBay, and it just showed a picture.
So does that say Chicago Northwestern? What does it say on the train car?
I
That's
can't quite
Probably
make that
Chicago,
out.
Milwaukee, St. Paul.
I don't see all that.
CHANR.
CNRSP.
C.
I'm not
Right
sure.
under the window of the locomotive.
Yeah.
I just think that looks like the one that was down that into town, south into town. What do you think, Steve?
Maybe. And this is one of the pictures you sent me, Bonnie, yesterday. Railroad maintenance crew at the Northwestern Railroad Depot in Maquoketa on South Main Street. All the men are unidentified, and the conductor, you can see right there, is looking on. Cummins and Mannerscheid Milwaukee Railroad employees in Bellevue, BVTWN, standing next to a boxcar of the Milwaukee, later the Bellevue Cascade Railroad, a narrow gauge railroad operating between Bellevue and Cascade. So this is another picture you sent me. So those are the names of the gentlemen then. Laura Etta Thaler was born in Maquoketa in 1868, the daughter of Jeremiah Thaler and Rebecca Davis. Her father, Jeremiah, worked as a teamster. I'm going to have to tell you kind of something funny about the teamster. So I try to be a little bit more efficient when I put these programs together, so as I'm looking for things, I find other things, and I kept coming across all these census where people were listed as a team master. And I thought, well, that might be kind of an interesting one. And so I gathered all these names, team master. They weren't team masters, they were teamsters. AI got it as a team master, I thought. That was it. So Laura married John Breeze Day, and she lived with her husband, who was a section hand, and their 4 children in Kansas, Nebraska, and Wyoming. So this photo was taken in Nebraska, the John Day family. And you can see like their youngest, sitting on, what do they call those cars? I don't know, hand paw? Just a hand paw. I just thought that was really a cool photo. Margaret Loretta Wallace was born in South Garryowen in 1897. Photo on left shown of Margaret with her two daughters, Marion and Margaret. And the photo on the right was taken in 1920 when she was 23 years old. And she was a clerk for the railroad in Council Bluffs, Iowa. Margaret Loretta was the wife of Ray Turley Fleming and Pershing Fay Haynes. Does anyone know that family? Clarence Carl Seiler, born in Bellevue, was the son of John Peter Seiler and Elizabeth Margaret Reed. He married Pauline May Lint in 1934, and they had two daughters. Shown is their 50th anniversary photo. This picture was taken as an advertisement for Prince Albert Tobacco. So Clarence, the man we just saw in the other photo, he was working for the railroad when he was approached by the tobacco company, wanting to know if he would model for one of their ads. That's just such a classic picture. According to Union Pacific, these are the past and present railroad jobs grouped into 5 categories: dispatching center personnel, passenger train personnel, survey and construction personnel, train crew, yard or field operations. So as I'm talking about people employed at the railroad, I try to plug them into where, what category that they were, the title of their job description was, but some of them didn't even fit in there. So dispatching central personnel. So a dispatcher schedules and monitors all the train's movement, responsible for traffic control and for communicating routine and unforeseen phenomena which may affect the flow of the traffic. And then the traffic manager, he oversees, the freight traffic manager oversees the freight traffic. A train master oversees train operations, and the yard master oversees the switching and the yard operations. And then the division superintendent, he has the authority over the section. And then you have the tower operators and the telegraphers, who are responsible for sending and receiving and routing messages. And the special agent, that means really the same thing as railroad police. Although there were other people that were called agents, so whether or not they were, police, I'm not sure. Laban Ernest Brown was born about 1874 in Indiana. He resided in Maquoketa and later in Anamosa. He and his brothers Jesse and Charles all prospered by working for the railroad. Laban married Nita Edna Warren, and they were the parents of Ethel and Leslie. And shown is his wife, Nita, on the right. Fred Nisha was born in 1858 in Germany. He and his wife Caroline and their 3 children resided in Union Township when he was employed in the railway yard. And I was unable to find any more information about this family, this last name. And so maybe, maybe it wasn't spelled right on the census to where it's just hard to figure out. Has anyone ever heard that last name before? Benjamin Franklin Hafner was employed as a tower man in the 1940s, and by 1950 he was a telegrapher for the railroad. He was married to Evelyn Clemmer, a native of Elwood, Iowa. The Hafners lived in Sebula and later moved to the state of Washington. Clarence Morton was born in Baldwin in 1895. By 1910 he was living with his family in Maquoketa. Clarence married several times and was the father of 5 children. And during World War I, he served with the 350th Infantry. In 1930, Clarence was working as an agent for the railroad. And in 1937, he was a telegrapher. Andrew Kent, an Army veteran of World War I, was born in Iowa in 1894. Andrew married Grace Allen, and they were the parents of Donald and Kenneth. The Kents lived in Baldwin and Grand Mound. Andrew was listed as a station agent in 1920, 40, and the 50 censuses. And he probably was for 32, I just didn't have that one available. Seneca Hazard was born about 1844 in Vermont. By 1870, Seneca was married and working for the railroad as a ticket agent in Milwaukee. The 1880 census shows Seneca and his wife Sarah with their 2 sons, Willie age 7 and Robert age 5, living in Maquoketa. And by 1990, the family was living in Des Moines, where Seneca continued to work as a railway agent. And then here's where I kept looking at his story, and it's just really tragic. He lost so many family members. So when he was 11, his mother died, and 3 years later, he lost his 5-year-old brother. And 5 years later, his sister dies, and then the next year, his infant half-sister dies, and the next year, his 22-year-old sister dies. Then he marries Sarah Frances Hand in 1870, and the next year, his son is born and dies. The next year, another son is born, and then he loses another brother and an infant half-brother. And then 2 years later, he becomes the father of another son, and 4 years later, his infant daughter dies. I just thought, how did he continue on? The funeral of S.W. Hazard of Des Moines, but who was formerly the Northwestern Station agent at Macocota, occurred last evening. The evening passenger on the Midland called a special car, which the officials of the road had placed at the disposal of the Solomon family. Frank W. Bowen was born in 1868 in Ohio, and by 1910 he was working as a laborer for the railroad and living in Union Township with his wife Anna Bowers and children Winford, Lewis, and Irma. And by 1920 he was a telegrapher, and in 1930 was a telephone operator. Again, for the railroad, telephone operator. Passenger train personnel. So again, a station master or depot agent oversees the operations, and the passenger director, directs the passenger traffic. I think we all know what a porter is, and now a stewardess was often a registered nurse. And a car attendant was one whose duties combined those of the porter and the steward on the modern passenger trains. The cooks prepared main entrees, and the pastry chefs assisted the cook, mostly with side dishes, breads, and desserts. Then you have the ticket clerk, baggage clerk, and RPO stands for Railroad Postal Clerk. Chicago and Northwestern Railroad Depot in Monmouth. And then this said, Bonnie, this is another picture you sent, so MNTWN. So that would be, those letters stand for?
Chicago Northwestern.
Okay. And then it says AKA Monmouth Depot, circa 1915 or 16. The man with the necktie is Agent Andy Kemp. And he's standing there beside the horse. George William Ryan was born in 1866. His father had served as a section boss for the railroad in 1880. By 1910, George was married to Maud Hayes. They were the parents of 8 children while living in Macocota. And when George was working for the railroad, 30 years later, at age 75, he was still working for the railroad. George died in Macocota in 1932. Charles Davis was born in Ohio. His father, William, enlisted in the Civil War. In 1861, he served 3 years and was wounded 3 times. Charles married Susan Woods. They lived in Monmouth when he was employed with the railroad as a station agent. Bert Story worked for the railroad as a cook, according to the 1930 census. And he lived in Bellevue. And his wife has a very unusual name, a German first name. The Stories were the parents of 2 daughters, Norma and Evelyn, as shown in both photos. Wayne McPeak was employed by the railroad as a baggage man in 1920, and in 1930 was a bookkeeper living in Macocota. His wife, Anna, was the daughter of George Gurias. I didn't get a chance to look that up. Was George the one that was a blacksmith? Anybody know? No? Delmer Luther Pulley was a baggage man for the railroad, according to the 1920 census. Delmer was born in Oxford Junction and worked for the railroad along with several of his brothers. He married Jessie Kozak, and they were the parents of Pauline. Shown are Jessie, Delmer, and Pauline in this photo taken around 1912. Shown on the left is Jessie Kozak Pulley, that was shown in the last photo. And on the right is Jessie with her brother Roy Kozak. And I think probably some of you maybe knew Roy Kozak. By the 1930s, Jessie and her husband were operating a dry cleaning business in Maquoketa. On Otto Street? Near where you live? Or,
It's in 200 block.
the building's still there? Widower John H. Lynch was born in 1856 in New York. By 1900, he was a baggage master living in Union Township with his 19-year-old daughter, Bessie. John's wife was the former Mary Briggs, daughter of Charles Briggs and Elizabeth Oak. And when I saw that name, I thought, okay, this sounds very familiar. So it was Elizabeth Oak's brother, William Royal Oakes. He was the author of the Civil War account that was titled On the Skirmish Line Behind a Friendly Tree. John Lynch died at age 56 and is buried in Sebula. Did you have your name up? Yeah. Okay. John's brother-in-law, Hans Briggs, was a railroad engineer and had worked for the railroad for over 50 years. And another brother-in-law, Fred Briggs, was an employee for the CM and St. Paul Railway Company for over 45 years. And brother-in-law Edward Briggs worked for several railroad companies, and when ill health forced him to quit, the elderly gentleman killed himself. I couldn't find a connection to this Briggs family and the governor of Briggs. Claude Evans lived on North Olive Street with his wife Nola Poole. Claude worked for the railroad for many years, first as a baggage master and later as a cashier. They were the parents of Eloise Evans. How many of you knew Eloise? Claude's parents, William and Flora, are shown in the photo on the left. And on the right, William and Flora with 3 of their children. Claude, I don't think was born at the time that photo was taken of his family on the right. Charles Cheney was born in 1899. He was a veteran, having served in World War II. He married in 1924, and the Cheneys passed away in California, but they are buried in Bellevue. And they were the parents of Carol and Roger. Charles' brother, Roy, was a bridge carpenter for the railroad. Also, Bellevue native Roger Cheney, who was married to Eleanor Stern, he worked for the railroad. And Roger had served in the Navy in World War II. He may have been Charles's brother, but he worked for the railroad in the 1940s. Survey and construction personnel included the following. And again, we got Teamster here down at the bottom. I think all of those are, you pretty well know what those are, and a herder is one that manages and tender of livestock. You probably knew that too. Did you know that?
So is this when the trains had like cattle cars or stock cars and they had to take the animals off and water them and put them back on the train?
Probably.
Is that what that would be?
Probably. Because these categories had to do again with the trains in the past and even present. So that's why some of these, obviously, those positions are no longer available. Paul Wagan was born in 1918 in Bellevue to Christian Jacob Wagan and Louise Bayer. He married Emma Elizabeth Moots in about 1943. And so in 1940, while living in Bellevue, Paul was a rod man working for the government. So I'm not sure if that means he was working for the railroad or if he was just like working for a road crews. I don't know. And the same thing with Harold Stoddard. So he was born in Monmouth in 1912, and in 1941 he was married to Bellevue native Geraldine Reistroffer Wonders. Geraldine had worked at the Savannah Army Depot and had owned and operated a waste management system in LeClaire for many years. By 1940, her husband Harold, age 28, was a rodman working for the government and living at home with his parents, Fred and Jessie. Joseph Whitney worked as a bridge carpenter, according to the 1930 census. He was the youngest child born to David and Evelyn Whitney. Shown is a Civil War photo of his father, Corporal David Cathcart Whitney, on the left, on the right, and his mother on the left. And more about his father in the next slide. So D.C. Whitney, 90-year-old Sebula, Civil War veteran, has learned to operate a gear shift car. He learned to drive a Model T when he was 80 and made a number of long drives alone. And he planned to drive to Louisiana to visit a son, which was 1,100 miles away. Wow. Another newspaper article, it says, boat to aid farmers to get to fields, bridge washed out. So the county bought the old ferry boat from this gentleman we were just talking about, Captain D.C. Whitney of Sebula, which he recently discarded for a new ferry boat. This is not, however, they were going to use it for the farmers, but it was not for the benefit of tourists or general traffic. It was only to assist the farmers who had to move their machinery across the river in order to cultivate their fields. Makokata farmer Harvey Dinkle worked as a bridge carpenter according to the 1930 census. Harvey was the husband of Dorothy Grant. They were the parents of Leah, Claude, and okay, so their third child, I love this name. Her name was Audrey Delight Dinkle. The cutest name. So Harvey had previously lived in Maslin. So I was just thinking, you know, when she got married, and then they say her name. Edward Meyer was born in Nebraska in about 1893. He married Bertha Klitsky in 1915, and they were the parents of Harold, Margaret, and Earl. Edward was a bridge carpenter in the 1920s, and in the 30s and 40s, he served as the bridge foreman. And I guess I didn't write where he was living, but he was living in Jackson County. Joe Sieverding, born in 1887, was the son of Joseph and Anna Sieverding. He was united in marriage to Clara Francis in 1911, and they were the parents of Loretta, Clarence, and Adrian. And by 1920, Joseph was working for the railroad as a laborer, and by 1940, doing bridge construction, also for the railroad. And on the left is a photo with Joseph and his siblings, Catherine and Anton. And the center photo shows the wedding couple, and Joseph and Claire are in the center here of the wedding couple. Albert Birch was born about 1895 in Germany. He married Mary Ratterman in 1920 and was widowed 28 years later. He later married Mary Nickel, and they were the parents of Leo, Albert, and Armella Birch. While living in Union Township, he was a machinist for the railroad. Albert served in the Army with the 615th Aero Squadron in World War I, and shown is his application for his headstone marker. Soren Clifford Lund Jr. was born in Sebula in 1911. Shown is a photo of his parents, Soren and Mary Lund, who had immigrated here from Denmark. By age 18, Soren was living in Union Township and working as a machinist. Joseph John Spoo was born in Lost Nation. Joseph grew up in Clayton County with his parents and 4 siblings. He married Baldwin native Lily Harnett, and they were the parents of Zelma, Joseph, and Lillian. The Spoos lived in Clayton County, Monmouth, and later Baldwin. It was during the 1930s when Joseph worked for the railroad. Lewis Heath was the oldest born son of John and Betsy Heath. Lewis lived in Monmouth during the 20s and 30s and was employed by the railroad. The photo on the left is of Lewis Heath and his mother Betsy. And the photo in the center shows Lewis's brother and his wife Sarah, and Lewis's father right here. And then Lewis is shown on the photo on the right. Jacob Klima was born about 1837 in Bohemia or Austria. By 1880, he was married with 6 children, living in Makokata and working for the railroad. He later moved to Wyoming and lastly to Baldwin. It seemed like I noticed a lot of people, like they were living like in Monmouth or in Wyoming, and then when they retired, they moved to Baldwin. So maybe Baldwin was a bigger city at that time. Okay, so I was telling you before, sometimes on the census you can't really tell what it is that they did. So on the bottom, the yellow, we'll talk about that in a minute. Alva Brown was born in Iowa about 1895. His large family included 3 sisters and 5 brothers. He's pictured here with his brothers. I'm not sure which one he is. Alva married Della Durbin, and they were the parents of 1 daughter. So Alva was a laborer in the 1930s, and by 1950 he was still working for the railroad. Now, this is the word right here that I can't tell, but they wrote, AI wrote steel-legged, which I don't know. Do you think it's steel layout?
Yep.
Steel layout, would that make sense? He's working on the bridge? Fay Kempter was a carpenter for the railroad by 1920s, 30s, and 40s. He inspected the train cars. He married Clara Dempy Wolf of Sebula, and they were the parents of Mary Ellen. Chester Francis Esme was born in Sebula, and by age 30, he was working in a button factory and living with his parents in Union Township. And then by 1910, he was married with 2 sons and was a laborer for the railroad. In 1920, he was a carpenter for the railroad. And by 1930, he was now age 60, still working for the railroad, and this time he was the carpenter foreman. He and his wife, Mary Miller, were the parents of Ralph and James. Lynn Castle was born in Oregon. By 1920, he was married, living in Union Township, and working for the railroad. He and his wife, Millie, were the parents of Elma Lynn, who's shown in the photo. His father, John Lafayette Castle, owned a grocery store in Oregon. And so in the next slide, it just shows his picture of his father and his grocery store ad. And he had a slogan, the best for the best, and the place for you to get the best is Castle's grocery store. So we have the train crew. This is the next category. Engineer, conductor, brakeman, fireman. And the fireman, part of the steam locomotive crew that fed the firebox with fuel. And on the diesel locomotives, the firemen would monitor the controls and assist the engineer. And we'll be talking more about the brakeman in other slides. Born in 1844, Oscar Henry was an engineer in the Civil War for 3 years with the 18th Indiana Infantry. He and his wife, Charlotte Van Zandt, were the parents of 4 children, and the Henrys are buried in Mount Hope. Shown is Lester Deppy of rural Bellevue. Lester was the last engineer on the struggling and failing Bellevue Cascade Railroad, a narrow gauge railroad previously owned by the Milwaukee Railroad that connected Bellevue with Cascade over very rough terrain. Lester made his first trip in 1934 and then brought in the last train to Bellevue on March 14, 1936, after the railroad had completed 56 years of service. Private First Class Herbert Tienan White served in World War I, Company D, 64th Infantry. He married Rita Reynolds in 1944. He was employed as an engineer for the Milwaukee Railroad and lived in Union Township. John Kinder was born in Wisconsin in about 1870. By 1900, he was employed by the railroad as a brakeman. At that time, he was widowed and living with his son Samuel, age 4. And there is shown in the center photo with Samuel. His wife, Naomi, on left, she died from an accidental drowning in Sebula when she fell from a trestle into the Mississippi. Photo on the right is of his second wife. Samuel Kinder, the father of John and grandfather of Samuel, served with Wisconsin as a corporal, light artillery regiment, and also served with the 32nd Illinois. Shown on right is Kinder's wife, Sarah Elizabeth Stover. They both died in 1916, and were like 5 months apart. In 1880 and 1900 census, it shows that Samuel was a carpenter with the railroad, and in 1910, at age 73, Samuel was the foreman. Gets a little confusing here. So Samuel Kinder's brother's son was also named John. He's buried in Evergreen Cemetery, Sebula. The newspaper article telling of his death, a brakeman is killed. John A. Kinder loses his life while at work near North Minneapolis Junction. He died within 3 hours after the accident. John was married to Anna Shirtliff and the father of a son named Arthur. Henry Martin was living in Bellevue by 1900 and was a conductor for the railroad. How many of you have heard the story about Henry Martin, the conductor? No. And there is a picture of the wreck that he was involved in the Images book that we have at the museum. Henry F. Martin sacrificed his life February 22nd, 1907 by taking hold of the brakes as the train he was conducting went over a trestle. He could have jumped during the accident on the narrow gauge branch of the Chicago, Milwaukee, and St. Paul Railway near Bellevue, but instead he stayed at his post in an attempt to save others. He died in his own home a few days after the accident. And then there was a passenger that did die during the accident, and others were injured. Martin was born in Bellevue in 1873. His mother had come to Bellevue from Holland and his father from Germany. On August 13, 1896, Martin married Frances Ernst. The Martins had only one child who died in infancy. At the time of the heroic Henry Martin's funeral, most of the Bellevue businesses closed in honor of his bravery. The wreck pictured was responsible for the death of Henry Martin. Mr. Martin was one of 8 children born to Theodore and Susan Van Macker Martin. At the age of 16, he began his railway work. At first, he was a transfer man at the Bellevue Depot, the Milwaukee Road, but soon won promotion of the position of brakeman, which he held for a number of years. About 1900, he was made a conductor on the narrow gauge. J.M. Fonda died at 80 years of age on September 1920. He was from Bellevue, was a railroad employee, and had worked as a mail clerk. And he was on that train that we were just talking about, that wrecked, that took the life of Mr. Martin and another woman. So during this accident, he received a broken wrist, a severely severed ear, face cut, and body bruises. Other crewmen were J.D. Hanlon, engineer Henry Martin, we just talked about, conductor Lewis Ernst, brakeman, and Mr. Eiler was the fireman. Benjamin Franklin Pulley was a brother to Delmer Luther Pulley, who was married to Jessie Kozak that we talked about, that they had the dry cleaning business. Benjamin began as a brakeman in 1900, and by 1910 was the conductor. And then another brother, Martin Wesley Pulley, also worked for the railroad. He lived in Maquoketa, Martin Wesley, and he was a conductor in the 20s and 30s, and was married to Felicia Skiff. And she is buried with her, or they are buried, let's see, in Oxford Junction's Mayflower Cemetery. Shown is the narrow gauge railroad bridge east of Zwingle. Pictured is Dick Sullivan, brakeman. This photo was taken early summer of 1933. Glenn Hu was born in Maquoketa and grew up in Otter Creek. He married Sarah Bell Clark, and they were the parents of Darrell and Cletus. Glenn served as a brakeman for the railroad in the 1930s, and in the 40s was a foreman. presumably for the railroad also. And there he's shown with his wife and then in front of his pickup truck. Irving Brown, son of Charles, was listed as a boster on the 1920 and 1930 federal census. A boster, I hope I'm saying that right, means the same thing as a brakeman. A boosterman, more commonly known as a brakeman or brake operator. And in the 1940s, he was employed as a dispatcher. Perry Arbuckle was born in Greeley, Iowa, and died in Jackson County. He was listed as a fireman in 1910 when living in Lakota. And by 1920, he was married and was now a brakeman for the railroad company. 1930, he continued his brakeman position, but this time was living in the Cedar Rapids area. German-born Otto Wacker began his career with the railroad by 1930 as a fireman, and in 1940 was a pipe plumber for the steam railroad. He was living in Union Township with his family. Otto married Mae Veach, and they were the parents of 3 or more children. So now we had a curator here, that Annabelle Lampy Wacker, and she had a brother and a father named Otto, but this Otto doesn't appear to be either one of them. So there were three Otto Wackers, or more. Either that or a bunch of dates are really, really wrong. Benjamin Stanek was born in Cedar Rapids. He served as a cook in World War I with the 133rd Infantry, Company D. He married Harriet Cumter, and they were the parents of 5 children. In the 1930 census, it lists his occupation as student steel. Now, there's too many letters there for that to be student.
Structural?
What do you think that says?
Structural.
Structural steel. Thank you. That would make sense. Okay, structural steel for the railroad. The Staneks are buried in Evergreen Cemetery, Sebula. In the 1940s and 50s, he was a depot carpenter. Before the widespread use of air brakes in the late 19th century, trains were stopped through the manual application of the brakes on each of the train's cars. Even after the air brake came into universal use, the brakeman still had to be ready to climb atop the train to manually set the brakes when the air brakes failed to work, or when a section of cars had to be cut from the train. In the interest of train safety, the middle brakeman, if there was one, would ride out in the open in order to be ready to manually apply the brakes if the need arose. Middle brakemen were most frequently used on long freight trains, as well as on local freight lines where freight cars had to be cut loose and added regularly. So our 5th category, yard and field operations. I think in the interest of time, I'm not going to go through and read what those positions are. George Markwell was a turntable operator in 1930. He was married to Frederica in 1901, and they were blessed with 2 boys, Louis and Fred. So the turntable operator, it's a specific specialized role that falls under the general scope of the switchman. A switchman's duties are broad and may include operating various track switches, coupling and uncoupling the cars, inspecting equipment, and generally assisting in the movement of rolling stock within a rail yard or terminal. A turntable operator specifically is a worker whose core responsibility is to operate a railroad turntable. And so that's a rotating platform for turning the locomotives or rail cars to align them with the correct track for servicing, storage, or dispatch. Maynard Dunham, a Sebula native, was a signal storekeeper by 1930. He married Bernetta Payton in 1926, and they were the parents of 5 children. Maynard lived a long life. There was a newspaper article titled "Planned for Memorial Day, 1993. An old Marine remembers World War I. In 1993, Dunham was believed to be Iowa's oldest living Marine at age 98. And among the shrinking number of combat veterans who served in World War I, He served with the 3rd Battalion of the 6th Regiment Marines. They were among some 10,000 soldiers who fought in the Battle of, I'm not sure how to say that, Belleau Woods near Paris, and in other campaigns in France. They gave the Germans all they could handle and earned the nickname Devil Dogs. The Dunhams are buried in Evergreen Cemetery in Sebula. Edward Marburger was a track worker for the railroad in 1910, and in the 30s and 40s was a section foreman. He was employed by the railroad for 45 years at Green Island, Sebula, Miles, and Moline. He married Cora Lingle in Bellevue. They were the parents of 4 sons and 2 daughters. One son died in infancy. The Marburger children shown in left photo of Elma, Earl, Art, and Harold. And the photo on right of Cora and 2 other children. Henry Marburger was working for the railroad in 1940 while living in Green Island. Other Green Island residents working on the section crew included Frank Ottaway, John Wyckoff, and Francis Curran. William Heller held various jobs before becoming a railroad employee. So they're just so different from each of them. At age 20, he was delivering fruit. And then later he became a wagon driver for a tea company. And by 1920, he was a caretaker at a clubhouse. And then by 1930, at age 52, he was a section foreman, working for the Milwaukee Railroad and living in Tatey Moore Township. Lower left photo shows William and his wife Roxanne Mode and their children Ralph and Maud. And then, of course, that's him in the upper photo. And then the photo on the right, he is the second from the right in the back row. So he must be right there. And I don't know, that looks, do you think, like a church photo or something? It wasn't identified as to who the other people are. So his father was a cigar maker in Galena. And he died at age 48 when in 1897 he fell off the Illinois Central Railroad Bridge over the Mississippi River, and he hit the ice and broke his neck. So I don't know if he was if he was just crossing or how that happened. John Baker's parents were of German descent. John, an Illinois native, lived in Washington Township with his wife Dora and was listed as a farm laborer in the 1900 census. In 1920, he and his wife and 6 daughters and a son continued to live in Washington Township while John was employed as a section foreman. Although still a foreman by the 30s, he was living in Lynn County, but by the 40s he had moved back to Washington Township. And the photo shows 13 family members, so I'm not sure if maybe there's like son-in-laws and grandchildren included in there. The Bakers are buried in Green Island. Corey Otto Griffin was married to Melinda Montgomery. They were the parents of 2 children, Harold and Edna. The 1940 census shows the family was living in Green Island when Corey was working for the railroad. Vernon Darling was born in Minnesota, and by 1930 he was living in Tatey Moore with his wife and daughter and working for the railroad. By 1940 they had moved to Minnesota. The following decade they moved back to Iowa, and at that time Vernon was a bartender. They were the parents of at least 3 children. Hans Schmidt was born in 1857 in Denmark and immigrated to the U.S. in 1864. His wife, Anna Hansen Skoll, was born in Germany. By 1910, they and their 5 children were living in Van Buren Township. The 1910 and 20 census shows that Hans was working for the railroad. And I don't know if that's, what his position was, but whether that is a uniform, a railroad uniform. Railroad section crew near Baldwin. And so in the front this would be John Beck and John Cloyd. And in the back, Jake Hale, and Mark Freyram. Edward Hamilton was a broom engineer for the railroad. Broom in a railroad context is primarily a tool. You know what I need to get a drink? Too much talking, right? And that tool is used to clear debris from the tracks, especially at the switches. It is used by track maintenance workers, but not typically by the train engineer who operates the locomotive. So a broom engineer, the railroad crew is a railroad crew member. He was responsible, this broom engineer, for assisting the engineer and was known for using the specialized tool called a switch broom. And the switch broom had a chisel tip to scrape ice and debris from the rail switches, and a broom end to sweep away the dirt and the sand and the snow from the rails. And they say that it says the tool is still used today for maintenance. Edward's parents had immigrated from Ireland, and he was born in Illinois. Edward married Annie Greenan in 1889, and they were the parents of 4 children. They first lived in Savannah, but then they later moved to Macocota. Eugene Knapp had a variety of jobs after working for the railroad as an auto mechanic by 1910. In the 1920s, he owned a grocery store in Clayton County, and by the next decade was a salesman for washing machines. Probably the ringer washer, too? Who knows? Next, he was employed as a farm laborer. Eugene Knapp married Lillian Timmerman, and she is the second from the left in this photo, labeled the Timmerman Girls. Eugene Knapp died in Macocota in 1968. William Elliott